Here to introduce the panel on Rethinking Renewable Energy on Brownfield Sites is once again Lloyd Kirk.
I have some people out in the back. I'm sure they'll be here in a second, but I want to thank McAfee and Taft for sponsoring our first break, and I appreciate that sponsor. This panel we have is a great panel, and it's going to be my great opportunity to introduce today's moderator. Robert Colangelo, who's the founder of the several leading organizations in the brownfield industry. He currently serves as the executive director of the National Brownfields Association, host of the national audio broadcast show, Green Sense Show, and publisher of Brownfield News Magazine. He is the author of 3 books on the subject of brownfields. He has served as an expert witness, providing litigation support regarding due diligence and impaired property valuations. He has testified to Congress in support of brownfields legislation and hosted a number of brownfield advocacy groups in Washington, D.C. And I am just honored to be able to introduce him. And Robert Colangelo, you have the...
Hundreds of thousands of brownfields or environmentally impaired properties sit undeveloped, creating blight and a drain on local property tax rolls. Renewable energy power generation, specifically solar and wind, represents less than 2% of the total U.S. energy produced in the U.S., and renewable energy production is expected to increase during the next decade. What are the facts, myths, and urban legends surrounding the use of brownfields for renewable energy projects? I'm Robert Colangelo, host of Green Sense Radio and executive director of the National Brownfield Association, and I'm going to serve as today's moderator for the roundtable discussion, Rethinking Renewable Energy on Brownfield Sites. We have assembled a group of luminaries, industry experts, and entrepreneurs for today's roundtable. Let's meet the panelists. Marianne Horinko is president of the Horinko Group. She's a renowned expert on environmental issues. She served as acting administrator, U.S. EPA, where she oversaw the 9/11 Ground Zero cleanup in Lower Manhattan, the Pentagon cleanup in Washington, D.C., and the U.S. Capitol anthrax contamination and the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster. At night, she leaps tall buildings in a single bound. Mike Sheriff is superintendent of generation of planning for Oklahoma Gas and Electric and has 38 years with OG&E. His area of expertise is in generation technology and was the technical lead on approximately $1 billion of wind asset acquisition. Marielle Boortz is the team leader, Public and Government Affairs, Chevron's environmental management company, and has over 30 years working with Chevron in various assignments, including process engineering, environmental affairs, and government affairs. And Dr. Ian Webster is founder and president of Project Navigator. Project Navigator's core expertise is landfill closure and management, and since 2008, they have been developing a pipeline of landfill-located photovoltaic projects in the Northeast and Southwest. Bios for our panelists can be found on the conference website, oklahomabrownfields.com. Marianne, I'd like you to put the brownfield issue in context, but before we go there, you've had an illustrious career, both serving in the EPA and in the private sector. What's your biggest accomplishment that you're most proud of?
My most cherished memory was watching President George Bush sign the Brownfields law into effect in January of 2002 in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania. I still get chills thinking about what an incredible accomplishment the passage of that legislation was, and a bipartisan accomplishment. I, of course, am a Republican, but I am thrilled to the core to see friends, Republican, Democrat, Independent, the vast majority of the citizens in this nation, embrace brownfields and embrace the concept that economic development and environmental protection go hand in hand. So that is my signature memory in my career.
Well, let's put the brownfield issue in context. In simple terms, a brownfield is vacant or underutilized property where the perceived presence or existence of contamination impedes its productive use. And as the forming acting administrator of US EPA, you know very well that it's very hard to characterize these sites, and there's no such thing as a typical brownfield. Can you paint us a picture of the brownfield landscape? How many are there? What's their typical size if there's a typical one, and where are they located?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, Bob, because brownfields are so ubiquitous in our society. These properties became contaminated because they're well located. They're valuable. They may be waterfront properties, they may be farms, they may be former gas stations, they may be dry cleaners, they may be an acre in size, they may be a corner of a rural area or an urban area. It's hard, it could be 1,600 acres of a steel mill in Lackawanna, New York. So it's hard to say what is a typical brownfields, but the single common thread for brownfields is they represent missed opportunity. They represent property that for some reason is stigmatized, whether for real reasons or perceived reasons, and they've been redlined by developers and lenders. And for that reason, we are locating new development in pristine areas like some of these gorgeous natural resources here in the state of Oklahoma, when we could be creating things like the beautiful Chesapeake Arena that I was privileged to participate in last night. Talk about renewable energy in that place. It was astonishing. So the common theme is missed opportunity, both environmentally and economically.
Any idea of how many are rural versus urban?
My hunch is that more are urban than rural, but there are still plenty of places here in the vast Midwest in our country that represent tremendous brownfields opportunities. For example, Kansas City in the Blue Valley. Region 7 is really a leadership region of brownfields. Old mining sites in regions 8 and 9, those represent real brownfields opportunities. I had the pleasure of going out to Montana with Governor Christy Whitman, my administrator, in the early part of 2000s, and watching her play a round of golf with professional golfers on the former Anaconda mining site. So there really are tremendous opportunities in the heartland.
So did you find that there was a particular contaminant that came up at most of these sites, or are there a group of contaminants that you find at most brownfields?
There are. There are obviously abandoned gas stations, petroleum contamination, benzene, toluene, and xylene. TCE is a pretty ubiquitous contaminant at all kinds of brownfield sites. Lead is obviously found at many brownfields. Dioxins and furans are very common. Arsenic is very common. That would be the basket of contaminants that I think you would find at the vast majority of brownfields.
And so most of these sites can be technically dealt with. It doesn't sound like you've got contaminants that present much of an impediment for development.
No, that is precisely right. And as people get more comfortable with some of these terms, obviously we're not all born chemists, which is really also a missed opportunity. But as people get more comfortable, they realize, a perfect example is I was married for 15 years to a man who sold real estate for a living. And people said to the two of us, how can that be? Marianne is running around stigmatizing all these properties while you're trying to sell them. But the simple answer is he gets that what I do improves the quality of life and thus the economic value in these communities. So his attitude, and we're hearing that with builders and developers now, is you're out there creating value. You know, whether you're creating parks or office parks or condos or golf courses, this improves the quality of life for all Americans, and that makes the property more valuable.
So what is the biggest impediment keeping these sites from being redeveloped?
Lack of communication, lack of education, lack of understanding. People who don't understand the opportunity that brownfields present and think, oh, there must be something wrong, she's speaking a foreign language, this is going to somehow gum up my deal, you know, it's too complicated. Education, education, education. I can't echo Mayor Murphy enough that education is really the cornerstone of successful brownfields redevelopment.
Any other things that we can do to remove these impediments?
I think collaboration, innovation, and especially bringing along the next generation of environmental entrepreneurs. Again, to echo Mayor Murphy, young people get the ethos of environmental protection. They get that sort of the baby boom was all about acquiring success and material things. And that's why they don't want to drive. And I'll date myself here, I'm a Gen Xer. You know, I sort of came up in kind of the grunge decade, you know, Nirvana, Alice in Chains, sort of, you know, we're all lost, I'm gonna have to work my whole life to support the retirement of the baby boomers. But now I realize that my parents gave me a great gift by being educators and having no money. Because they said, get out there, hustle, work hard, and things of the greatest value can't be measured in terms of dollars. It's measured in terms of experiences, like last night's basketball game. It's measured in terms of natural beauty, like the gorgeous natural resources that surround us. So I think if our young people who intuitively understand that get that that environmental ethos does indeed improve the quality of life, not just for us, but for future generations, then I think that we have nothing but opportunity ahead of us.
Well, thank you for putting the brownfield issue in context. Let's move over to Mike Sheriff. Mike, this panel is talking about renewable energy on brownfields, so I'd like to start big picture and talk a little bit about the power industry. But before we go there, you have 38 years with the power industry. That's a lot of experience. What's changed most since you started first with OG&E?
A couple of things have changed. Our generation mix has drastically changed. And when I first started with the company, we started adding coal plants. In the first 10 years, we added 2,500 megawatts of coal plants, so 80% of our energy is generated with coal. Start of the 2000 decade, we said no wind. Since then, in the last 7 years, we've added roughly 800 megawatts of wind, of which we own over almost half of that wind. And that's a drastic change, and we own it because we think it's going to be cheapest for our ratepayers. There was no state mandate to do it. And it's a fuel hedge, energy hedge, and to see that, and the implementation of a fully operational smart grid is two drastic changes have been made actually in the last 5 to 10 years.
Well, as I said, we want you to put the energy issue in perspective. So if you can give us a percentage breakdown of the different sources of energy that are used to produce electricity, I think that'll help cast our discussion.
Using the EIA, or Energy Information Agency numbers from 2011, a little over 40% of the energy in the U.S. is generated by coal, and that has been dropping significantly the last couple of years. Natural gas is 25%, nuclear is 20%, and then the mixed bag of renewables is 13%. But what is interesting is wind was 3% just last year, which wind is significantly climbing, but when you have a capacity in the U.S. of 1,000 gigawatts, it's hard to make significant increments in that because it's such a huge number.
Well, coal is cheap and it's readily available. Why is its use dropping?
Use is dropping due to some of the age of plants and regulations that are starting to apply to the plants, driving the cost up, especially on some of the older plants. Some of the older plants are what we classify as small, and it's not cost effective to put the controls on them.
Well, you mentioned nuclear is a significant part of that mix of energy production. And Reuters reported on May 17th that the state-run Japanese Oil and Gas and Metals National Corporation will boost investment in overseas oils and gas projects this year because of the idling of nuclear units as a result of the Fukushima crisis. Nuclear energy, as we mentioned, is a significant source of electric energy production. How has the Fukushima crisis impacted the use of nuclear energy in the U.S., and how has it impacted nuclear policy?
I think that's yet to be determined. It's interesting, the Vogtle plant back east just got approved. The chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has just resigned, effective whenever his replacement is appointed. I think it will slow down the nuclear development, but we still need to have nuclear, and especially the small modular units, because we need a diverse mix of fuel. We can't put all of our eggs in one basket. We need gas, coal, nuclear, and all types of renewables.
Marianne, as a former acting administrator, is nuclear energy a clean source of energy?
Complete agreement. And this is an area where we truly need to invest in education because the average age of a nuclear plant operator in this country is 60. So we need another generation of radiochemists and engineers to get out there and embrace this technology. Nuclear is a great deal of energy in a very compact footprint. We have sufficient capacity at existing nuclear plants without siting any new nuclear facilities in this country to double our production. And if we end the ban on reprocessing, the nuclear waste issue becomes greatly diminished. So I think nuclear has got to be a part of the mix.
Well, many European countries, mainly Germany and Japan, are changing their nuclear policies. Who's going to be the winner with nuclear energy being decreased? Is it going to be renewable energies or oil and gas?
I concur that it will be a mix of both. I think there's significant investment in this country in renewables, and I applaud that development. I couldn't agree more that coal has got a big target painted on it. It's an old school technology. And I think that the oil and gas companies are becoming ever more innovative and looking at new ways to capture more energy from the sources that we've got. We've got tremendous resources in this country in the area of petroleum and natural gas. And I think we just need to ensure that public awareness and regulatory policy evolve hand in hand with the development of these technologies so we can do the best we can to get the best bang for our buck.
So the summary is we need a basket of energy sources as we move forward. We're no longer going to be dependent on mainly coal and gas. It's going to get much wider. Dr. Ian Webster, any thoughts on that?
Well, as you know, Robert, I operate at the very different end of the spectrum of large projects. My goal in life is to try and develop small-scale, megawatt-scale solar projects on brownfield sites. So we are not talking the quarter-acre gas station. The brownfield sites that I look for are ones potentially in the 30 to 40 acre range where I can build a 2 or 3 megawatt plant and greater on that. I do think as the challenges that I face in my life are obviously finding the money to build these facilities, finding the most appropriate sites where the power that the facility generates can be interconnected onto the grid. I think the continued low price of gas, probably for the next 4 or 5 years, is definitely going to impact the ability for a small-scale solar power developer like myself to get these plants online. But I think in the longer term, solar definitely has got a mix. One of the key variables when you cost forecast the economics of solar facilities is trying to remove the cost of the land from your project pro forma or economic computations. So if you can use a brownfield sites where your lease costs or cost per acre are far less, you can generate an avoided cost in your cost computations that really helps the economics of the project and thereby find money to develop them.
Well, the theory behind using renewable energy is to reduce air emissions, including greenhouse gases, and to become less reliant on coal and foreign oil. Is that a myth, fact, or urban legend? Marielle?
Well, first I want to say that I agree with my fellow panelists, or Chevron agrees, that the world needs all energy sources to meet the growing demands for energy around the world. And Chevron is doing its part. We're investing in conventional, which is the oil and gas side of the business, as well as renewable energy. And in fact, investing in renewable energy and energy efficiency is one of our business strategies, because energy efficiency, conservation is the most readily available form of energy there is. Key areas for us are our geothermal operations, which are in Indonesia and the Philippines, next generation biofuels, research and development in those, and also expanding our energy efficiency business, because our energy efficiency business helps not only parts of Chevron, but also external customers in improving their energy efficiency, reducing emissions, like you referenced, greenhouse gases, and they do that through facility upgrades, as well as looking at installing alternative or renewable energy sources, particularly solar. So we need it all.
So it's fact?
And it's fact. We need it all, and we're working on all of it, yes.
Mike, your thoughts on that?
You mean, we've already said we need it all, diversity. I mean, I'm not sure where you're.
So the question is the theory behind using renewable energy is to reduce air emissions, including greenhouse gases, and to become less reliant on coal and foreign oil. Is that myth, fact, or urban legend?
The coal is just a recent add. Because when renewables got started originally, it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, coal was not a big target on it as it is today. But to reduce the dependency on foreign oil, I would sort of disagree with, because less than 1% of the electricity generated today is with oil. So that's not really a target, but I see it more as a fuel hedge. We know what the prices will be with the renewables, and emission hedge.
So what is the biggest factor that's keeping renewable energies from being more widely used?
The cost of renewables versus the existing technology that we have today that generating.
Ian, thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's clearly the dollars per watt. You can generate from coal and gas at fractions of a dollar per watt. For solar power to develop a facility, you're talking still about $3 per watt installed, although the forecast, and I'm sure you read the general media with Chinese solar panels getting dumped in the US market, etc., the cost of solar power will probably drop to $1 per watt by 2020. In fact, Secretary Chu at the Department of Energy believes $1 a watt and less is possible. So there will be economic parity, I think, in potentially a decade ahead. But again, the mix of solar or wind is going to be very, very small compared to the conventional, especially gas-fired, centralized power plants. One other remark, though, I think what's happening is the U.S. energy generation systems are large centralized facilities, and there is a need to move to a more distributed systems where smaller, thousands of smaller systems feeding the grid as opposed to large gigawatt-sized power plants that basically generate the majority of the power in the U.S. That's a trend that basically favors renewable power.
Well, let's move to another topic along those lines. Let's talk about energy security and energy surety. And for those that are not in the power industry, why are these issues important, Mike?
When we talk electricity is the only commodity in the world that has to be generated instantly when it's used. That means that we have to have sufficient generation online when somebody turns a switch, and have sufficient generation online when somebody's plant has a hiccup and knocks offline. With renewables, specifically wind and solar, more so are variable energy. It's there when it happens. The sun shines, the wind blows, and that is more challenging to keep the grid operating reliable. It sounds trite to say you have to generate it the instant it happens, but that is actually true, because if you don't, you lose. The frequency gets a little bit off 60 cycles, and if it gets off like less than a half a cycle, grid starts going black. There's challenges. Wind blows more at night in the spring when the load isn't here. Solar is great during the summer. Putting it on and distributed generation, I agree with what Ian's saying, but there's more challenges and different learnings that we have to do. You talk to people that run the transmission system, and they say, we have been projecting loads for 100 years. We know how to do that, and that's true. But they haven't been projecting loads with people putting solar panels on their house, which changes their load profile. That's going to change the whole way they do it, and they don't understand this yet, and it puts more uncertainty. And that's more uncertainty. There's ways to cancel that, but you have to be aware of it up front, and that's some changes in the industry have to come along.
So that's energy surety, making sure you have energy when you need it. Marianne, could you take the energy security issue? Define that, and why is that important?
It's important because these are fundamentally all resource questions. And you can't look at the energy piece without looking at the food piece and the water piece, because they're three inextricably linked. You have to look at the food, the energy, and the watershed in its totality to get a sense of the resource picture. And where the resource issues play globally is often a source of fundamental unrest. For example, the whole Arab Spring phenomenon, a lot of what's going on in the Middle East and in sub-Saharan Africa, those aren't tribal clashes, those are resource issues. It all comes down, as Ian said, to this. And without energy security globally, we're going to continue to have that very vicious regional friction. And so it's important to us as a nation and other nations to ensure that we have sufficient resources, water, energy, food, globally, to ensure that we don't see the atrocities that are going on in the troubled parts of the globe.
Well, the EPA's Repowering America's program is working to enable and facilitate the development of wind and solar projects on brownfields. In your opinion, of the hundreds of thousands of brownfields that we said are out there, how many or what percentage do you think actually offer redevelopment potential for solar and wind projects?
It's very location dependent, obviously. I would estimate probably somewhere between 5 and 20%. Places that are located, remedies that are selected that involve some kind of institutional control, a cap or a covenant, are ideal because you know that land will not be disturbed for generations. So that's ideal for solar panels. Former mining sites are a perfect example. I have a client that is a former copper smelter in Arizona, New Mexico, and they're putting solar up all over the place. And so that's an ideal scenario. I think former coal mining sites are perfect for wind because they're located in mountaintop areas. They're not going to disturb wildlife. They're not going to disturb sight lines. And that land is not suitable for a whole lot else. So I really commend EPA and my dear friends Sam Coleman and David Lloyd and others for promoting the Repowering America's Brownfields initiative because I think it holds tremendous promise.
Thank you. Marielle, let's move to the corporate side of the equation. Chevron is a Fortune 100 company. Many think of it as an oil and gas company, but you're actually an energy company. Can you explain your philosophy and where renewable energy fits into that equation?
Yes. As I said previously, we're investing in renewables as well as energy efficiency. That is one of our business strategies because we're trying to increase our portfolio, the diversity of sources, energy conservation, like we've reduced our energy use by over 30% since 1992. And renewables is a part of that. And we have built 3 renewable energy installations on brownfield sites in the United States. One is Casper Wind Farm. That is a relatively small wind farm, 11 turbines outside Casper, Wyoming, built on a former refinery site where we're looking what is a beneficial reuse for this property, for this land, and wind fit. And so we're returning this land back to producing energy, which was previous life was. And then we have 2 solar installations, which are research technology development, again, as we're trying to develop emerging technologies in the renewable energy space. One is at a former mine site, Cuesta, New Mexico, on 20 acres on a former tailings area with like 123 big, 20 feet, 15 feet diameter things on the tailing site producing power for the local area. And then we have outside of Bakersfield, California, again at a former refinery site. It's a research and development facility testing solar installations from 7 different vendors. So we're looking at evaluating these different technologies and looking at things that may be better than what's on the market today, as well as looking for things we can apply within our operations, as well as the customers of our energy efficiency business.
So why does Chevron venture into these areas of renewable energy?
Why? Because we need it all, and we're an energy company, and we want to be a part of it. And it's more than just the oil and gas, even though the projections show oil and gas is going to be a big part of our energy supply for many decades to come. But you need it all, and we want to be a part of it, investing in renewables as well as the conventional.
And how do you measure your payback?
How do we measure our payback? Well, for the research and development projects, it's the learning. It's the learning about the different technologies, supporting the development of those technologies, and again, what can we apply in our business so we can be more energy efficient, as well as have the broader portfolio of energy supplies, as well as what we can provide to our external customers.
Well, the oil and gas business is very cyclical. It's got ups and downs. People get laid off and hired as the peaks and valleys, but you have over 30 years in the industry with the same company. How did you survive, and what's your key to success?
Well, one of the key things, like as we were talking about yesterday, the oil business has changed since when I hired in, and Chevron has changed. We've gone from when I hired in, it was primarily very much an American, U.S.-based company. We're now more global company, larger company. So the key thing is be flexible. Don't be resistant to change. You have to almost welcome change and thrive on change and always be willing to learn.
And I want to ask you a question. I want you to be candid. Is Chevron giving lip service to renewable energy, or are they rarely dedicated to this?
No, we are dedicated to it. We have the investments, like I mentioned, the 3 facilities. One is a commercial wind farm, but the 2 research and development facilities in the solar. We have investments in the biofuels, expanding our geothermal, looking at the energy efficiency spectrum. And I didn't mention, but a lot of the things we do is in partnership, because I think Marianne mentioned the key. One of the keys is collaboration and partnership. So we do that with government, with universities, and even with communities, like to cite the wind farm. We did a lot of external stakeholder, as we call it, external stakeholder engagement, talking with people, having dialogue with people, doing the environmental studies to make sure there was not only benefits for us as the project proponent, but also benefits for the community and others.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Ian Webster, you're a true American entrepreneur. You love risk and you love the reward, but you weren't born in America. And is it your accent that gives you away? You have a Doctor of Science in Chemical Engineering from MIT. You've started your own business, and you've found a niche developing commercial solar projects, photovoltaic panels on landfills. What makes America great?
What makes America great? Apart from the beer, some whiskey, maybe not. Well, I think it truly is the ability for a foreigner, an immigrant like myself who came here in the mid-'70s to pursue an education at the great educational institutions, then work for a major oil company in the early part of my career, but also realizing being a little bit different perhaps than folks who stay with careers internally. I am entrepreneurially, so about in the mid-'90s, I said goodbye to my previous oil company employer, now acquired by Chevron, and set up my own company that focused primarily on environmental engineering aspects. But what I've been able to do, again, following my entrepreneurial bent, is to turn what was initially a pure environmental engineering firm focusing on landfills and brownfield sites closures to take some of that staff and reapply them in the renewable energy area. So we've taken probably about 1/3 of our 35-person staff and have retrained them, not much training required, to basically focus on this solar development initiative. And you can definitely do that in Europe, no question about it, but the business climate in the US, where I think innovation and creativity is rewarded, is still it's a great place to come and work.
But we don't hear that enough, so I appreciate you saying that. Well, in theory, your business model sounds like a great idea. You take land-constrained markets and you put photovoltaic panels on these landfills, and that gives you a dual land use, and it has tremendous cost benefit. In summary, can you explain your process and why that makes economic sense?
It's a long road to go from site identification and the belief you can build a 3 or 4 megawatt solar facility on a landfill or a brownfield site to the ultimate realization of flicking the switch and connecting it to the grid. The business model's got a number of discrete steps in taking. I mean, probably many people in the audience here have come to this meeting because they have potentially or access or connections to land that's lying fallow, etc. And given the downturns that have happened in the classic, say, tilt-up buildings development brownfield marketplace, that there's probably a space for some of these sites to be transitioned or repurposed to renewable power use. And what I'm looking for basically is the ability to lease the land for 25 years. Don't purchase it, because that's definitely bad in the economic model. Lease the land for 25 years and sign a power purchase agreement with a power off-taker. It could be a large utility, or it could be behind the meter, off the grid, where a company like ABC Manufacturing requires X megawatts or X kilowatt hours of capacity per year. The hurdles that I face are obviously making the economics work. We have some large backers that help us. We have a backing from an Italian utility that's helping us grow our projects both in the Southwest, the Northeast, and also the Caribbean. And they're looking for about 9 to 10% ROI or IRR on these projects. You can make the economics work, and the fact that the panel prices are dramatically coming down only positively affects the economics. The other hurdle, I think, overall is the interconnect. One has to approach, as Mr. Sheriff said, approach the independent system operator, go through an interconnect study to make sure that your introduction of your kilowatt hours doesn't affect the overall balancing in the grid. That study is expensive and time consuming. And then the other hurdle I overcome is basically the post-closure environmental permitting. These projects are not technically complex if you can find the right geotechnically appropriate site. The tough thing is getting the environmental permits, the environmental impact report statement done, etc. But again, an EIR, for example, is definitely facilitated and hastened by the fact that it was previously disturbed land as a brownfield site. So you put all this together, that's what we do, and I am still as enthusiastic about this area as I was about 6 years ago when I ventured into it.
So it sounds like the key issues are, one, finding a buyer for the power, two, finding a landfill that's close to an easy hookup for your power connection,
Right.
and then three, making the economics work. It sounds like the technical issues are usually something you could overcome. Piercing the cap on a landfill is not.
Can be
some-
avoided, yeah. And I think community acceptance, I mean, all these projects, especially if you're going after an urban, the best sites for us are urban located brownfield sites where load is definitely available nearby. And typically when I've worked on the environmental side of the house, putting a cap or putting in a groundwater collection system, the number of public meetings you would have, sometimes with some rancor in the ranks of the community, you don't see that when one comes and says, on the top of this landfill, I intend to put solar panels. It's generally very well accepted by communities.
Marielle, you probably deal with the community. What are your thoughts on that?
I would totally agree with Ian saying, as I said, with permitting our Casper wind farm, I think it was 3 years or more of studies and multiple community meetings and making some adjustments to the project. Originally, there was going to be 13 turbines. The final project was 11 turbines. And so community acceptance is very important, and on all three sites that I mentioned with our 2 solar installations and the wind, those are sites that are still undergoing environmental remediation. So support of the agencies was key, as well as the community.
I mean, one remarkable thing back to the community acceptance, talk about partnership, we have a partnering relationship with Chevron on some small solar projects, and we are developing a 2.2 megawatt facility on a landfill at Big Bear Lake, up where the ski resorts will take the power in the winter up behind Los Angeles. But remarkable to myself, after one presentation to the Sierra Club endorsed the project in writing, which to me was, I guess amazing is the best word to use it.
So not only are developing brownfields a way to come in as a white knight, but when you put green power on brown, you're doubly accepted in a community.
Well, and I might add that I worked on a project for EPA in the late 1990s as part of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act Brownfields initiative that was led by Peter Robertson, then Deputy Administrator, and it was in Chester, Pennsylvania, which is famously an environmental justice community. And so we were very concerned about doing a pilot project in this community because they'd had so much adverse interaction with the EPA. And so we traveled. It was a former Pico energy plant that's now a beautiful conference center on the banks of the Delaware, and met with the local ministers who were the linchpin of this environmental justice community. And we explained the project, and the chair of the local ministry said to me, "Let me restate something to you. You are taking the waste out of our community, and you're asking if we are opposed to that?" And I said, "I just wanted to get your input, that's all. But that sort of epitomizes to me the whole community acceptance paradigm around brownfields. It's vastly different than, here comes a new power plant.
Well, for most of the real estate community, they don't look at brownfields that way. My experience, 80% of all brownfields are just bad real estate that's environmentally impaired. In this down real estate market, where there's plenty of traditional real estate available at a discounted price, why would anyone want to develop a brownfield?
It's an uphill battle. And, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, working at EPA, you're often the skunk at the garden party. Getting real estate developers to talk to you is never an easy task.
That's a new one, the skunk at the garden party.
It's not new to me. I'll go back to Ian's remark about rancorous community meetings. I've stood in plenty of them, most notably when I went to Hazleton, Pennsylvania, when I was acting administrator to defend an oil pollution act cleanup. And the citizens were very angry. It's coal country, and so the real estate there was never in a good shape. And they wanted us to buy them out. And at EPA, we frown upon buyouts because you still have to clean up the community. You can't put a fence around it. And so you pay twice, essentially. And these people had been affected by the lack of coal jobs, and so they saw this as an opportunity to get rid of their real estate. And my husband's family is from that part of Pennsylvania, coal country. And so I got up at the public meeting that evening and said, in an attempt to sort of diffuse the tension, because we had state troopers at the door of the church. That's how angry this crowd was. And I introduced myself. I'm Marianne Horinko, and my husband's family is from this part of Pennsylvania. And if you walk around behind the church, you'll actually see a lot of headstones with Horinko on them. And one wag called out, "I hope there's not another one after tonight." Okay, so no stranger to the courage it takes to approach people unfriendly to the Environmental Protection Agency. But just like any other endeavor, what you do is you look for the willing. You know, the unwilling are always going to be intransigent. You know, if you start with them, it's going to be a long haul. But you look for the willing, and a willing heart can accomplish anything. And eventually, the curmudgeons will come along, or not, their loss. But, you know, it's all about the art of the willing.
Ian, why would you use a brownfield?
Economics. It's all about the money from my perspective. You're trying to get that 10% return on your financier's investment in your facility. You're asking for them to, again, put in you're roughly $5 million per watt installed, or $5 million $1 million per acre. I can't find the debt financing I require for these jobs unless I can get that greater than 10% IRR. As I said earlier, the ability to remove land costs, especially in urban areas, substantially from the project pro forma. The only way to do it is with brownfield sites. In fact, you cannot make a broad pronouncement. One cannot make a solar power project work in an urban area on raw land unless you use a brownfield site.
Marielle, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that, as we were just discussing, it's not only internally what the project proponent gains from the project, it's also what the community and the external stakeholders gain. Doing the renewable energy projects or developing a brownfields can be totally aligned with economic development goals of that state or that city. Like in New Mexico, the case was they had a goal, green economic development and be renowned and have solar in particular. So we're part of that. Supporting EPA's Repowering America initiative. So there are also external drivers that you can just for support of a project as well on brownfields.
There's a lot of incentives out there from states and federal agencies for brownfields. How important is that to make the brownfield deal work?
It's definitely important right now. I mean, the investment tax credit that one gets is, again, back to my economic spreadsheet. Anything you can do on the cost avoidance side is going to make these jobs go. So it's very important. I think, though, going ahead, though, I've got, as a developer, most of you probably heard at the turn of the year in Northern California, the Solyndra, I guess I'll call it debacle. From a developer's perspective, and I was kind of rubbing my hands because it demonstrated the fact that, unfortunately, $500 million went down the drain. But on the other hand, the reason why that monies did go down the drain was because the technology there was being superseded by newer, lower cost technologies coming in. So it's this drive towards Secretary Chu's dollar per watt. So I think if you can get to, and I've got scores of graphs in my office showing the downward generation trend for solar power. If you can get into the $1.20, $1.40 a watt, these incentives will not be required to make these projects get the 10% return.
Let's switch.
Or the other thing is not just the incentives, the energy prices go up.
I agree, and that's another part of the power purchase agreement. One, as a developer, has to make sure you get an escalation factor built into your PPA.
Well, and I'm really talking fuel prices.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back to the economics in a second, but I want to just put things in context here, Mike. There's a lot of myth and urban legend surrounding the grid. It's often thought of as this homogeneous system where electrons are transferred across the country, but the grid's actually owned by over 1,000 different entities, and it consists of 3 parts: power generation, transmission lines, and distribution. What condition is the grid here in Oklahoma, and how does that compare to the rest of the country?
The grid here in Oklahoma is getting ready to be super strong. Our company is investing $1.5 billion in the next 5 years, and that's our share. When you build a transmission line, you build it from, if we own one end and somebody owns the other end, we only build half of it. So the transmission line is getting to be really strong. If you want to connect to the transmission line, let's talk about the eastern part of the United States. There might be, I don't know, 300 or 400 people that own it. They're basically in the northeast, and I'm saying Oklahoma, straight east and north, there are only a half dozen that run it. That's who you deal with. If you go in the western part of the United States, it's utility by utility because they don't have a big RTO. Now, I didn't mention Texas because Texas is their own thing. It depends on where the grid is homogeneous because it is tied together solid. For really the best bang for the buck for renewables is almost like Ian's talking, but it's distributed, and it's on the customer side of the meter. If you have a brownfield like this building, put solar panels on the roof, then you are not competing with the wholesale market, but you get a lot more compensation. And if you start doing that, it is utility by utility. And in Oklahoma, there are 6 IOUs, investor-owned utilities. Doesn't sound bad. There are 98 co-ops and municipals.
So it's a real hodgepodge of where investment is and what the state of the grid is.
Correct.
And one of the key limitations of the distribution of electricity, as we earlier mentioned, is that it really can't be easily stored, and it has to be used as generated. As electricity is transmitted, it experiences a loss due to resistance. How far can electricity actually be transferred through the grid to actually be economical and balance loads?
You really don't transmit electricity from Oklahoma to New York. We can make sales of electricity that way, but what this actually happens is we make a sale and it's supposed to go back east, and it goes back maybe to Arkansas, and then Arkansas units that would have been serving their load go back. I have not really heard studies. I mean, I can put power any place on the Southwest Power Pool and sell it. The Southwest Power Pool goes from a part of Louisiana, South Oklahoma, all the way up to Nebraska. And part of that's just marketing cost. So it's not really a physical limitation of the electrons.
Yeah, can I add to that briefly? Because one of the siting criteria is you can get into the power system, and that was the other thing that made our projects work. You can get into the electrical system, get into the grid, and I know in the Bakersfield facility in particular, they said an important siting factor was the fact there was a use there that could take the load, the energy we were generating, because it was near where we had our Kern River field in Bakersfield, and that was a very important factor for the utility as well.
Well, let's talk about variability. Two benefits of renewable energy are that they produce little pollution and they have a lower cost to operate. The downside is, we mentioned earlier, the sun and wind don't blow 24/7, and it makes renewable energy production variable. From a power purchaser or producer's perspective, why is the variability of production energy a concern for the utility?
The people around here like to have air conditioning in the summer. And the peak load in the summer is, say, an August day, somewhere around 5 o'clock, and there is barely any wind blowing. We have to have capacity to serve that load. Wind, if you have a 100 megawatt wind farm, we can count it for maybe 3 megawatts. So wind is great energy, and there's a difference in my mind between energy and capacity. It is here in the April at night, it's blowing great. Really like the distributed generation, because it's on top. Especially solar, it's across the peak. You can lower the customer's bill that way by having it behind on their side of the meter. But the reason again for the concern is keeping the grid on all 100% of the time. People today, it used to not make the news when 100 people are out of power. OG&E might have done itself a disservice, because you can go to our website and look and see who has power and who doesn't. You have 100 people out.
Power of transparency.
That's it. And now it's on the news.
Right.
It didn't used to be, but because we are expecting it, it's something. Nope. When that switch flips, it comes on every time.
Well, let's switch over to the power seller's perspective. What are the challenges you face in connecting a project to the grid?
It's the permitting process. I think, even though we're talking here as though the development of solar on brownfield sites is a relatively mature, or at least it's a pathway to get there, the processes and the permitting process I go through, for example, in Southern California versus New Jersey, are vastly different, and there's a tremendous amount of expense associated with it to the small developer. Interconnect studies are costing anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000.
And how much time do they take?
Well, you submit your data to the ISO, the Independent System Operator, and then they'll come back probably 6 months to 8 months to get the information back. The other hurdles are, I think, gaining access, working with municipalities. What our biggest resource for land are municipalities who may own land they're wondering how they can get revenue from in this current day. And so going through another large thing is finding these sites. Either the municipality potentially issues a request for offers or an RFP, or proactively we will go out and try and find landfills that we can make an offer on. That takes a lot of time and a lot of expense associated there. And then on the permitting side, I think the environmental agencies in New Jersey, it's New Jersey DEP, for example, while there seems to be a lot of projects in the pipeline, very few have actually gone through to the point where a plant has been permitted. So with staff in the environmental agencies at the state level, you are crossing new regulatory document writing ground. And we're all, as the developer, we're trying to be rigorous about that, but also streamline it, because we know when we go back again, our first version will become the model for the second one, and we don't want to make it too onerous on ourselves.
Let me make one comment on the interconnection. I agree 100% what you're saying. You need to understand that OG&E has to go through that same criteria. Even though we own the transmission lines, our transmission lines are operated by the ISO, and we have to apply to them and have to go through that same process. And if you're at 6 to 9 months, I would love to see that. We're closer to 18 months. And the process, this is the Southwest Power Pool's process. It's called a cluster study. I won't say anything else. That's their name.
We can interpret that. Well, one of the keys to your business model is production tax credits. Can you explain the variability and the importance of variability of those between states and the incentives that are offered, and the importance of that to the economic viability of your project?
Well, I think we crossed that one before. I mean, they're important right now to get projects going. You only can get the tax credit as cash in your pocket once the project is built. So that is you're still looking for the out-of-pocket cash from your investor to construct at potentially $3 or $4 a watt installed. And so the investor is still taking a large risk. I do believe in the future, again, as I said earlier, the declining cost of panels, even though there was some pushback by the Obama administration and the Chinese manufacturers last week about a large tariff being on the panels. I think we are going to see panels reach a level where the economics of the projects will stand alone 2020 and beyond, without any incentives from government sources.
Well, this is an election year, and speaking of incentives, what is your prognostication if the current administration is in place? What happens to renewable energy?
You're looking at me first?
Yep.
I'm in forums like this, I'm a political agnostic. I think that the direction that the Obama administration has taken is definitely a positive one for the renewable solar business. There's no question about it. And I would hope that direction and curve of progress and I guess policy continues with no matter who gets into power. I'll leave it at that.
Very diplomatic answer. Mike, can you be less diplomatic?
The United States hadn't had an energy policy for how many years? Decades. I think it's longer. They hadn't had an energy policy since I worked for the company. It's very fragmented. I see renewables increasing. Don't have a clue at what speed that could be. It could be at just a small growth, or it could be leaps and bounds, but it depends upon what other kind of regulations are imposed upon our existing fleet.
Marianne?
Well, I certainly won't speak for the Obama administration, but I will note in a self-serving fashion that under Presidents Bush 41 and 43, we saw both the launch and the culmination of the Brownfields program's enactment and passage into law, which I'm very, very excited about. Energy is not a partisan issue. If Governor Romney is elected, I'd note his record in Massachusetts is terrific. In fact, you'll hear later on in this workshop, this conference, from my friend Mark Weinrich about the good work that Greenfields Environmental Trust Group has done with solar at Lowell, Massachusetts. Jim Connaughton, my dear friend who is head of public policy for Constellation Energy, is working very closely with the Romney campaign, so you'll see more emphasis on nuclear. And frankly, Governor Romney is famously a businessman, and this makes good economic sense. So I think you'll see, regardless of administration, continued sound fiscal policy with respect to renewables and brownfields.
Marielle, any
Yeah,
thoughts?
I'm not going to predict.
We won't leave you out.
I'm not going to predict. Thank you for not leaving me out. But I will say our wind farm was a commercial project, and we did avail ourselves of available tax credits for renewable energy on that project.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time, so I wanted to give each of you a last 30 seconds. If we've left something out, if you want to add it here. But the question I wanted to get answered is, where do you see the future opportunities for putting renewable energy projects on brownfields? Ian?
Well, this goes back to I think the question that was asked early on of Marianne about how many sites are out there. I actually took a look. There's apparently 400,000 brownfield sites, as quoted by US EPA, and 16 million acres of that is available for solar and wind production. For reference, that's about 3 million megawatts, so 3,000 gigawatts of power. These numbers probably don't mean much to you, but it's a heck of a lot. The direction, I think a fraction of these sites practically are solar and wind possible. And so, again, what I'm looking for, and what I think the solar power business needs, is large acreage sites that can be repurposed for 25 years, that the highest and best use is solar, i.e. low geotechnical stability landfills or mining sites, and just grind through the interconnect process and kind of bring them online. So, but the challenges I think also are gas prices compete today directly with the ability for solar to become online. $2, 1,000 cubic foot is a tough price for a solar project to compete against.
Marielle?
Yes, we view our brownfield sites, they're underutilized assets. So when you have an underutilized assets and you're in the private sector, you go, what is the best, highest use? How can we get a beneficial use of this property? So renewable energies is one thing that we look at, because when we look, we say the world needs it all. So bringing in renewables helps with the energy supply, which is supportive. If we can put it on a brownfield site, that puts an underused asset back into beneficial reuse, and it can help the energy equation, it could help the community, help economic development goals. That's all a good thing.
Thank you. Mike?
I think renewables on the brownfield really is behind the customer's meters when you're restoring buildings.
And what does that mean, behind the customer's meter?
If you think where your meter is, if something happens behind that, you're responsible for the wiring. The other side is utilities. If you get behind that and put a solar on it, you can reduce your load, and then you're being compensated not just the energy cost, but also the generation, fixed asset cost, the transmission and distribution cost. So you're getting a lot more bang for your buck, and it's a lot easier to justify it that way. Now, there's not the economies of scales of large operations, but I think that's where it's going to see it.
Thank you. Marianne, last word?
3 last words: partnerships, innovation, and flexibility. Back to your question as to what makes this country great, innovation is the hallmark of American society. My dear friend Lincoln Bloomfield, former Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs under Secretary Colin Powell, told me recently that Fiskar, the electric car company, is making a second generation of the Tesla. The original one, they're looking at cars as a technology play, which is interesting. They've designed the Tesla from the ground up, not a new model, the way traditional car companies approach it, but if you were designing a car just today, like 1906, what would you design? And much like technology, the original Tesla is $200,000, so it's a toy for rich people. The 2G Tesla is going to be a $70,000 play. So now, kind of investment bankers are buying them. The 3G Tesla is going to be a $20,000 car. At that point, I jettison my 2-door Volvo and I buy myself a Tesla because the storage is now this thin. So that kind of innovation. And then the other thing is the collaborations that make this country so strong. We're a democracy for a reason. Alex de Tocqueville once said, Where in Europe you would see a monarchy, in America you'll see an association. And that collaboration, as Marielle said, working across boundaries, working across the public and private sector, I think will drive us in positive directions for renewables on brownfields.
Thank you. Well, we've gone over our time. If you want to talk to the panelists, they'll be here after the panel. But I wanted to thank each of them for their excellent and provocative discussion. Marianne Horinko, Mike Sheriff, Marielle Boortz, and Dr. Ian Webster. I also want to give special thanks to our organizers, the Brownfield Conference, the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality, especially my good friend, Lloyd Kirk. Thank you very much for the opportunity to moderate this panel of luminaries and entrepreneurs. I'm Robert Colangelo. I invite you to attend the National Brownfield Association's Big Deal Conference. We're in Chicago on October 3rd and 4th. You've been to the rest, come to the best. Visit brownfieldassociation.org for more information. Remember, land is a terrible thing to waste, so build green on brown. Thank you very much.
Rethink, reinvest, reinvent through renewable energy on brownfield sites. Robert, thank you. Panel, thank you. This was great. Let's give him another round of applause. I'd like to thank Chesapeake and Crone Dunlevy as sponsors for this panel, and I appreciate that. We have an international panel from the West Coast to the East Coast. I told Mike, he's their Okie here representing, OG&E, so he was in the center part. But anyway, they did great. Following our break, sponsored by CRA, there's a number of breakout sessions that will start. We have 3 breakout sessions starting at 11 o'clock. So go to one of those, and then we have lunch back in here at noon. See you then.